Good afternoon, everybody. If we can get started. I'm Gary Tomlinson, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center. I said that to most of you yesterday afternoon. Welcome back for the second of David Shulman's Finzi-Contini lectures. Yesterday's was entitled The City of Copper from the 1001 Nights, and David spun around an amazing, intricate, eerie, and even comical story, his own eloquent, gripping tale, weaving together threads from many languages, many centuries, 3 continents. Today's lecture is entitled From Arabic to Tamil to Mimosas of Oliver Laxe. Mimosas is a film we screened yesterday before his lecture. In talking with David this morning, I learned that it was a chance viewing of the film that set him on the path we've been hearing about, the path that has taken us roundabout and through the city of copper with its ghosts, its genies, and most memorably, its edible mermaids. I remarked on the serendipity of this film screening, and David immediately asked, but do you know the etymology of that word serendipity? No, a typical David Shulman question I had begun to learn. I said, no, I'd never thought of it, I realized. It comes, he said, from an old Persian story, The Three Princes of Serendip. And Serendip was the Arabic name for Sri Lanka, an island that, in old Arabic navigational lore, could only be come upon by accident, just like the city of copper. Serendipity links, then, Sri Lanka, the city of copper, the 1001 Nights, Arabic, Tamil, the film, David's project as a whole, and probably all truly interesting scholarly endeavors. But the three princes of Serendip, the story goes, traveled the world making discoveries by accident and sagacity of things they were not in quest of. Serendipity was not for them a question of accidents alone, but of knowledge, learning, and wisdom. So it is with David's project. We had a sense yesterday of an extraordinary mind at work, of prodigious learning, and of the consummate storytelling that can take shape in their presence. The first lecture left us on the edges of our seats. Let's get on to the second. Please join me again in welcoming David Shulman to the podium.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you, Gary. Hello, everybody. So I'm assuming that you have some knowledge of the story. I'm going to try to offer a kind of explication of what I think is the real intellectual driving force of this story. I'm speaking about this mysterious city of the dead, the city of copper, Medinat al-Nukhas, which is hidden somewhere in the unknowable reaches of the Libyan desert, or possibly in the Moroccan Sahara, or somewhere on the road to India. A city that has no gates or doors that can be opened from outside, though one of the locked gates can be unlocked from the inside, if you can get inside, and if you can then decipher the strange inscription engraved on a copper horseman who is standing there. And on our way to the city, we heard about the mysterious lord of that gate that has no gatekeeper, Sahib al-Bab alladhi laysa lahu bawwab. And I argued at the end of yesterday's talk that this is a story not so much about death and the unthinkable mystery of dying as it is about time, or rather times in the plural, about the incompatible temporal rhythms that, taken together, comprise the magic of this bizarre city. I don't want to dispel the magic, only perhaps to deepen it a little by speaking about time the way the Muslim philosophers and freethinkers of the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries understood it. Let me say again that I think our story emerged, at least in part, out of that matrix, the matrix of those discussions, and that it is in its own lyrical way a continuation of them. The primary axis of contention runs between Abdel Razi, I mentioned him yesterday, and his Ismaili opponents. So here are 2 names I would like you to try to remember. Abdel Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. Try to remember that. Yeah. The reason you need to know the whole name is because Razi means that he came from the city of Rai. That's today part of Tehran. And there were a lot of people who came from Rai. It was a major center in those centuries. So there are many Razis. But the one I want to focus on is this Abdel Razi. He lived from 854 to 925. He was an extremely controversial and original thinker. He became known in the European tradition because he was a great doctor, and he left many medical works, a huge medical encyclopedia, so that the Latin European Scholiast tradition refers to him as Razes, R-H-A-Z-E-S, Razes. He was very well known. That's one name. And among the Ismailis, so Ismailis are a particular kind of Shias, among the Ismailis, the name that I'm going to be focusing on is a Persian scholar. He's a century later, 1004 to 1088. And his name is Nasiri Khusro. Nasiri Khusro, he was also a great poet, and he was a traveler. He was a very restless fellow, wandered the whole of the Islamic world, also went to India. He was converted to the Ismaili doctrines in Cairo at the time that Cairo was a Shia bastion under the Fatimids. And he is a very eloquent, articulate exponent of a particular strand of this Ismaili world. In particular, he engaged with the thought of a Razi. So we have Abdul Bakr Razi and Nasiri Khusro. And as Henri Corbin was a great Islamicist, specialist in this area, he correctly said the opposition between Razis and the Ismailis is one of the great moments in Islamic thought. Other scholars have also noted this intimate link between the city of copper and odd or conflicting temporalities. Marina Warren, in her book on the Arabian Nights, nice book, she states correctly that the caravan winding its way through the desert is moving backward through time to the time of the long dead, who can nevertheless still speak to us through the inscriptions they left behind. And Abdel Fattah Kilito, that's another name I warmly recommend to remember. Abdel Fattah Kilito, he's a he's a scholar for sure, also a writer. He's Moroccan, publishes in Arabic and in French. 2 or 3 of his books have been published in English. He's a wonderful, wonderful scholar, certainly one of the most insightful of the modern scholars of the Nights. He says in a beautiful essay that the story offers us 2 distinct temporal modes. First, we enter a kind of eternal present, the time of the jinn, who emerged from the copper bottles in which Solomon had imprisoned them, and who call out as if Solomon were still there to hear them, at tawbah, I repent, I will never disobey again. These jinn have no awareness of past time or of death. They live in a kind of eternal, tortuous present. But secondly, there is the deep past of the lost city, perfectly preserved, whose dead people, including their queen Tadmur, call out to us from a terrible, even infinite distance, very much as the storyteller himself or herself so often does. And these 2 times, says Kilito, are literally incommensurable. You cannot measure them one against the other. That's a good thought. I think there's a way to deepen it maybe, but I'll be coming back to that in a moment or 2. I want you to think again of those poetic inscriptions that may well be the oldest stratum of the story, the seed around which the narrative slowly budded and grew. Who is the real author or authors of these poetic texts, warning us over and over of what happened long ago and what will surely soon overtake us as well? And perhaps it has already overtaken us. Our lives, like those of the dead souls in the city, are from the moment of our birth heavy with time, or with timefulness. Yet we also experience time in the fleeting present moment, as did the authors of those texts and the coffee house narrator singers who must have composed them in some kind of extended present moment or moments. Sometimes I think those inscriptions were composed by time itself a living, conscious being. That's a Razi. Time itself, caught up in continuous movement between its two contrary inner rhythms, the rapid, uneven pace of evanescence and the slow but steady drip of eternity. Maybe both these rhythms are active at any given moment. Time speaks to us in its own voice in these texts. Repent. It is not yet too late for you, though it is always too late for me. That's the true voice of time. Time is never on time. But I think we can do better than that. It's a strange, haunting message. I'm talking about the inscriptions. We get to hear it over and over. One could say that tense time, with its linear, sequential divisions into past, present, and future, is confronted in our story with tenseless time, an eternity that is experienced as a frozen and discordant present moment. The travelers to the city stand face to face with that deadly eternity, itself a kind of ultimate transience. So I want to explore that confrontation briefly, and I'm going to give you, this is going to be a short digression, maybe 10 minutes or so, about the debates on time and eternity and life and death, and a little bit about God and the soul that occupied the best minds of Khorasan and Baghdad in the 9th to 11th centuries. And I'm going to try to point out a little later, of course, what is at stake and to see what parts of it are relevant to our story. So this is 10 minutes of a kind of executive summary of 300 years of very intense philosophical debate, much of it centering on these questions of time. Suppose that time is something real, a power or a force, maybe a thing, maybe an imagined thing. That's what Nasiri Khusro, the Ismaili philosopher, says. He says time is something that human beings imagine, which, by the way, doesn't mean that it's not real. Or maybe time is a living substance, something that we encounter under two complementary but also contradictory aspects, both of them independent of God. That's Abu Bakr al-Razi. Time exists, or rather moves, both in the guise of wholeness or perfection and in the more transparent guise of sequence, of discrete units or parts, lethal parts, that can never constitute a whole. That first sequenceless, immeasurable time is called, it has names, it's called Azal, or Abad, or Mudda. Mudda means sheer duration. Or Sarmad, or Dahar, which also means fate, or Zaman Mutlak, that means absolute time. And ordinary time, which is time that is measured, as Aristotle said, by the movement of the heavenly bodies, is called Zaman, just time, or Zaman Makhsur, or Waqt Muayyan, that is a defined moment, or Daf'a, which is a kind of second. And it's not hard to hear its continuous rhythm. Taf, taf, taf. Did any of you look at the handout from yesterday? I want to read you what Abu Bakr al-Razi said about this. If you look, those of you who have the handout, look at the bottom of the page. And I'm just going to read you a few lines. This is from a conversation that was recorded by an interlocutor who did not agree at all with Abu Bakr al-Razi, in fact regarded him as a kind of a heretic, but was interested in him. And his name, the interlocutor, is also a Razi, Abu Hatim al-Razi. I told you there are a lot of al-Razis. So all we have is the record of this conversation by the interlocutor, Abu Hatim al-Razi. And he says, he speaks first, and then he records the answer. He says, I said, let me have the real meaning of absolute time, so that we shall be able to imagine it. For if we withdraw the celestial motions, the passing of days and nights, and the elapsing of hours from our imagination, time is then annulled in the imagination, so that we do not know its real sense. So locate for me the motion of dahar immeasurable duration that you assert to be absolute time. He said, this is Abu Bakr Razi, he said, do you not see how the being of this world elapses with the passing of time? Tough, tough, tough. It, absolute time, does not come to an end and does not vanish. The same is true of the motion of dahr, if you imagine absolute time. You notice he also is speaking about an imaginative act. Time, he says, is an imaginative perception. And as you can, I've given you only a little part of this conversation. If you read further, it becomes very clear that he thinks, Razi, that absolute time, this muddha, sheer duration, is also moving. It's not a static entity. It's in motion. And you can hear it if your ear is attuned to it. Tough, tough, tough. I was thinking maybe we should just be silent for a few seconds. You can see if you can hear it, the passage of eternity. Okay, so how do these two temporalities relate to one another? This is a big question. Both are aspects or rhythms of time. Is it possible that eternal time gives birth from within itself to everyday time? And if so, was there a temporal moment when this transition took place, when time began to run more quickly, racing toward the death that awaits every living being? That's what the Ismaili philosophers thought. They thought there was a certain moment when our kind of time emerged out of or was created from within this other pre-existing absolute time. So there's a moment when eternity turns into evanescence. Interestingly, the Ismaili philosophers insist that the transition was instantaneous. This caught my attention. I've been reading Nasr-i Khusru for some months. It's an amazing thing. He insists that there is no gap whatsoever between this absolute time and then suddenly this time of our everyday experience. So it makes you wonder why that's so important. Anyway, at a particular point that was actually not a point, time happened, so to speak. I'm following the Ismaili line of argument. So on the one hand, there never was and could not be any gap between eternal time and our time. God didn't just wait for the right moment to start the clock, and in any case, he could not, God forbid, have been late, or maybe even too late. There's an expression for that in Persian, ta'khir kard. So could there be a subtle delay inside God? No, there cannot be. On the other hand, human beings, as we know, do tend to be late. In fact, this may be what defines us as beings. And the Ismailis have a way of describing this. They have a kind of myth of origin. So I'm going to just tell you a little tiny piece of this myth, okay? But you'll see how that notion of being a little late is very critical. There's the very first man. He's called Al-Adam Ar-Ruhani, the spiritual Adam. Actually, he was a kind of angelic being, and the third in a series of emanations. Well, let's just so that you know what I'm talking about. There's God. There's an emanation, which is aqal, that is intellect, and kind of universal intellect. That's then followed by another emanation of what is called nafs. Nafs is the breath of life, or the spirit, or maybe the soul. Those are the first two. And then this Adam Ruhani is born, the first human being. He's number 3. But the fascinating thing is that he was driven by despair and self-doubt to a critical existential hesitation that took some time. Some say that he saw the entire universe as actually nothing, a no thing. And this perception led to a melancholy stupor from which he eventually tore himself free a little too late. Or maybe the problem was a kind of pride and self-inflation, in which case this human creature has an affinity with the satanic figure of Iblis. You should keep this in mind. Those of you who saw the film yesterday, you remember at the very beginning of the film, Shakib, this kind of kooky mystic, he has a whole story about Iblis, who he calls Imlis. In any case, by the time this person, this first human being, regained control of himself, 7 other angels had interposed themselves between him and God. So he'd been demoted from the 3rd angel to the 10th. And a rather big gap had opened up. And that is who we are. We are creatures of the gap. We were, they say, created and brought to life within that gap. This belated moment has a name. It's called ta'akhur, or takhalluf. That's an infinitesimal late coming, which is also a moment of turning toward God, iltifat, the act of the soul or breath, the nafs, that awakens to its entanglement in the world of forms and pleasures and seeks to return to its true home. But all this takes time, a time that is, once again, a kind of no time, a singular simultaneous instant in which eternal duration turns into its opposite, sequential, rapidly flowing, ultimately and universally lethal time. So I'm not going to be able to describe the details of this transition. It's a complex mythological portrait. They're very interesting and precise. I just want to say that in this view, time, all of time, has within it a constant tension between movement and quiescence. In Persian, junbanda and aramida. Or in Arabic, they talk of the 2 faces of time, one that is mutarik, in motion, and the other is sakin, dwelling, resting, remaining. And that tension is what constitutes the rhythmic movement of time as we know it. It's something in us, just as we are trapped within it, like in one of those copper caskets with the jinn. What is more, that tension shapes every one of our moments. So here I just want to tell you, in the mature kalam, that is to say the orthodox synthesis of Islamic philosophy, they have a notion of what they call the anat. That means nows in the plural, the nows. The nows are these little instants. And you know, the amazing thing, this became the orthodox Islamic view, the amazing idea is that Allah creates the world anew every single instant, every moment, every one of those little now moments. And those are called anat in the plural, the nows, you know. So, I mean, obviously there's a problem here about what actually that means, what these nows are, what is this, what kind of time is this, the present? It's always the hardest of all temporal modes to define. And usually paradoxical, no matter how you look at it. Because the present is the fullest expression of that tensile but also creative relation. There's a great Israeli Arabist, Shlomo Pines. He's, by the way, the person who, in a way, mediated the work of Paul Krauss, whom I mentioned yesterday, the person who had collected the fragments of Razi. Pines wrote an amazing book about atomistic views, and he says, this is Pines speaking, he says, the closer one looks at the alleged substance of time, the more the latter reduces to an instant, for whatever is past has become nothing, and the future does not yet exist. That's the end of the quote. So the only real temporality would thus be that elusive present instant that, however, has the potential to expand to include all other forms of time. But the Ismailis also say that presentness is only a sign or a mark, nishani, or a trace, delineating past from the future. So the present moment is the trace that opens up infinity in relation to itself. And that mark or trace is weighted down with time, an infinite yet transient time. So interesting, isn't it, that transience and infinity or eternity keep somehow coming together in relation to the present moment, and also in relation to our story. That's the end of this 10-minute executive summary. I want you to stay with me for just one moment more. There's a South Asian Indian aspect to this. You see that the present moment can open up to absorb all other kinds of time, a range of rhythms at odds with each other, would have pleased the great 5th century Indian philosopher of language, Bhartrhari. He too thinks of an unlimited presentness out of which other fleeting realities may emerge. That unitary temporality generates from within itself, or within language as sound, a mostly illusionary temporal sequence. An object, this is Bhartrhari, an object, any object, is past, present, and future all at once, an identity. These distinctions, he says, are in reality no more than different designations. And I think that Bhartrhari, directly or indirectly, left his mark on the Islamic philosophers of time, and ultimately on the city of Copper. This is one part of the Indian stratum or substratum that has molded the story into the form we have. So, summing up to this point, we have at least two distinct temporal modes, eternal time and transient time. Both are in movement with different velocities and rhythms. They're also continually weaving themselves into one another, thereby creating a present moment. One, the familiar rapid pace of time as we normally experience it, is apparently derived from the other, infinitely slower rhythm, in a paradoxical process deeply bound up with the emergence of human beings and their longing to return to that original slow temporality. Actually, presentness comes from the superimposition of these two modes on each other. And apparently, there's also something like timeless time, and maybe also deathless death. There's a tension, not easily resolved. Movement and quiescence, wholeness and fragmentation, as if time were, in each present moment, oscillating between these poles. Or as if the present, what we call the present, had a part of itself that is eternal, and another part that continually disappears into that eternity. So what about the temporality of our story? I'll be summing it up in a little while as I draw this lecture to its close, but for now let me say that the city of Copper inhabits and is ruled by both temporal modes, but in a peculiar way. It's as if the cogs of time had locked together, the two modes canceling each other out, so a third rhythm had to emerge, a present moment alive only with death, frozen in its dead aliveness, trapped inside the gateless walls of the city like the jinn in their copper vessels, almost as if we ourselves were those jinn. Or perhaps we're the inadvertent spectators and witnesses for whom the city has been waiting for centuries, maybe for all eternity, waiting to capture us. And as visitors, we hover for a moment, amazed, moved to tears, terrified in that moment, which feels like an eternity, listening to the silence that nonetheless speaks to us in a dead language, translated, of course, into Arabic. I can't resist quoting here a single bite, a single verse by Kashmiri poet, modern Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali. Some of you may know the name. He has a beautiful poem called Ghazal. He says, "The only language of loss left in the world is Arabic. These words were said to me in a language not Arabic." But okay, I was talking about a third rhythm, and that third rhythm is neither eternity nor human time, but a kind of no time that might also be the only time that ultimately counts. That is, time as imagined, as Nasiri Khusru says. And it is real because it is imagined. That no time, it's a kind of present, claims several victims, but those who survive to continue the journey are forever changed. Not like the jinn with their anachronistic cry of at-tawbah, and not like the Sufis who have prepared themselves well for this journey, but in some deeply human way that even we, the listeners, can perceive. And moreover, I want to quote Nasiri Khusro again. He says the whole purpose of the world is in humanity, as distinct from the individual man or woman who is mortal. And one could also translate the sentence, the world becomes complete or whole or perfect through the human. What sort of human? The sort who lives in that no time, which is a kind of eerie, double-faced present. Well, if there were more time, I could tell you some other really fascinating things about the way these Shia philosophers went with these materials. But I want to go back to the Indian substratum that I mentioned before in its modern version. So I'll get a little relief from the philosophy now. I'm going to talk about the Tamil version of this story that I mentioned yesterday, Tamil prose version. Remember, I told you that this version miraculously reemerged from a long forgetfulness. The author, Imam al-Arus, apologizes in his introduction to the reader for the fact that he's translated the verses, these beautiful verses, into prose. So I think this is the right moment for that little experiment that I promised you yesterday. And here's what I want to do. First of all, I'll explain in just a second. I want to say that the Tamil text of Imam al-Arus, it's full of vocabulary taken from Persian and Arabic sources, also filled with Sanskrit and Tamil terms, some of it resonant of the Bhakti devotional tradition, some of it from Tamil tantric thought, and a lot of it relates to time. He talks about kala virodha, the contrary movement of time or against time, and kala bheda, the constant diffusion of time into very tiny units. But what I want to do is I want you to hear how one of those morbid inscriptions, we'll take the first one that I read yesterday, how it sounds in Tamil prose. But first I'm going to read it again in Arabic, because my feeling is that even if you don't know Arabic or Tamil, there should be something in the sheer phonic or sonic expressive force that gives you some sense of the texture of these two different texts, even though they're telling the same story. And not only the same story, but actually translating the same supposedly lost Greek inscription. So let's see. I'll read you the English translation first, and then the Arabic again, and then you'll hear it in Tamil. Tamil prose. So in in English, a people, they made things, then wept for the wealth they relinquished. A fortress. Inside it, the last word about rich lords meeting in the dust. Death finished them off, tore them asunder. They lost to the dust whatever they had gathered, as if for no more than a moment they'd laid down their loads to take rest, then of a sudden moved on. You heard that yesterday. And this is one of those inscriptions that as soon as it's translated into Arabic, Amir Musa breaks down and weeps and faints and so on. So in Arabic, قَوْمٌ تَرَاهُ بَعْدْ مَا صَنَعُوا يَبْكِي عَلَى الْمُلْكِ الَّذِي نَزَعُوا فَالْقَصْرُ فِيهِ مُنْتَهَى خَبَرٍ عَنْ سَادَةٍ فِي التُّرْبِ قَدْ جُمِعُوا أَبَادَهُمْ مَوْتٌ وَفَرَقَّهُمْ وَضَّيَعُوا فِي التُّرْبِ مَجَامَعُوا كَأَنَّمَا خَطُّ رِحَالَهُمْ لِيَسْتَرِيحُوا فَجْرَةً رَحَلُوا. Okay, you want to hear it in Tamil? Okay. This is Tamil prose. Arindu vitta patuvarhal vittu chelu mariyangale, avarhal yeperi patuvarhal, avarhal shede panigalinna, yenbavaigalai pir kalita varhalike arivipavai halaha irkindrana. O in the vasaril nindra I padalai kan bavane, I malikail suhitti rundavargalai pumil vaitrikul kuttan kuttamai tinike pattadai terinde kolla pohiravane. Unake arivike padavadavade, avarhal sehramahavande kundirundarhal, avarhalai maranamarita vitade, I manai vite avarhala hatre patta vitarhal. Sounds a little different, eh? So this is what it means in English, translated into an English prose, like the Tamil. Oh, traces left by those who are destroyed. It's an apostrophe to these traces. Oh, traces left by those who are destroyed. What sort of people were they? What works did they do? All such things are signs meant to bring knowledge to those who come in a later time. Oh, you who stand at this gate and see this song. You know, interestingly, you have to see this song. I guess you can't hear the song. It's an inscription. You are about to learn how all those who lived happily in this palace have been stuffed, one gob after another, into the belly of the earth. Here is what you are to know. Together they lived it up. and then death destroyed them. They left behind this palace. They were driven far away. A lot of the expressive force in both of the texts rests upon the verbs, which are mostly passive. Very pronounced in the Tamil, because it's a little unusual in Tamil. This is a slightly antiquated mid-19th century Tamil prose. Remember, I told you it's perhaps the first Tamil literary prose that we have. Once these people were happy, the next thing you know, they were stuffed into the belly of the earth, and they left only traces, Ariyalangal, addressed as if alive and aware by the anonymous writer of the inscription himself. Tell us who they were, what they did, what happened to them. And in a slight recursive, reflexive twist, the author's voice mingles with that of the epigraphist, the author, who exactly is writing this lament. A certain knowledge is at stake. Read on, O reader, I pity you for what you are soon to know. Sounds like the author of the story, the storyteller. Sometimes the Tamil takes off in a lyrical, figured image of its own. This is something unique to the Tamil. So here's a little tiny passage. Amir Musa and Sheikh Abdul Samad, they looked keenly for a long time at the fortress-like walls of the palace. And the longer they looked, the more it seemed to them that those walls were weeping incessantly without tears, and as if they were howling and screaming without having experienced any kind of sorrow whatsoever, as if they were singing a lament, Opari, remembering those who had lived here happily and then died and disappeared. And lament, Opari, it's a very well-known Tamil genre. It's used in funeral dirges and rituals for the dead. There's a good book about it by a dear colleague of ours. Her name is Isabel Clark Desses. She died in a kind of odd accident just about a year ago. She was very young. The book is called No One Cries for the Dead, Tamil Dirges, Rowdy Songs, and Graveyard Petitions. So, Opari, this lament, and the howling walls comprise a figure of speech. It's called Utpreksha. In Tamil, it's called Tatkuri Petram. That is classically an ascription of some feature from one domain to something or someone from another domain, and very often this is the projection of intentionality and feeling onto an inanimate object, like the walls of a city. And there's an onomatopoeic aspect to the long sentence. You can hear the howl. And beyond all this, there's a paradox. Tearless tears. A scream with no trigger, but for the unremembered memory that we hear about it at the end. Anyone who knows Tamil poetry feels at home with this sentence. This is a South Indian sentence that seems perfectly capable of reflecting back upon the Arabic or Persian source, illuminating it. And in fact, once you've read the sentence, you'll hear that howl whenever you reread the Arabic version of the Nights. Indeed, all of the inscriptions, and perhaps the story as a whole in its various versions, have become a lyrical, unending, heart-rending lament, the very stuff of sequence and the texture of movement through time. And as I've stressed, all of them are in prose. I want to say something more about prose, both this experimental early Tamil kind and maybe prose in general. Prose, perhaps contrary to our intuition, as I said yesterday, is always a discovery or an invention, or some combination of these two. It differs from metrical verse not merely formally, but more importantly in the way its internal organization, its syntax, relates to some version of reality. That's the Auerbach thesis, that syntax always mimics the way the world is put together mentally. But for my purposes tonight, the important point is that prose always comes with its own rhythms, and these rhythms always reflect, in various ways, a tension inherent to the temporality itself, very much as we saw earlier. At the very least, prose embodies a disparity or discrepancy between two temporal modes, tense time, whether or not it is morphologically signaled, modal, or aspectual, or simplistically sequential, and a rhythmical movement of time that cannot be squeezed into any series of tenses and their morphs. Prose sentences very often weave in and out of these two minimal rhythms, especially, by the way, in Dravidian languages, as speakers of Tamil or Telugu or Malayalam know from experience. Tense time is always less than that other time. Non-tense time has a way of overwhelming tense time. Just as our natural experience of subjective time, with its uneven flow, its vast incongruence of intensities, often overwhelms the comfortable illusion of Newtonian time, flowing in even units without gaps. That's one kind of Newtonian time. And some have claimed, like a colleague of mine in Jerusalem, Gabi Motzkin, that the clash of these two temporalities, personal time as experienced moment by moment and sometimes recorded in diaries, and impersonal, objective time, that clash is what gives birth to modern historiography. Because history, in order to write history, you need at least two incompatible temporalities. And it is not by chance, as Motzkin argues, that modern Western European historiography comes into being in prose in tandem with the French diarists like Saint-Simon in the first half of the 18th century. Prose, historiography, and I might add the concept of realism are all facets of the same problem and all belong in a way to the same historical moment. So I want to have time to explore this theme tonight with the attention it deserves, but let me just say first that prose is thick with time, and in some sense it's about time, or better, embodies time. And second, that prose regularly offers the reader or listener a selection of diverse temporalities, which also embody differential causalities, held together, as Auerbach saw clearly, by the illusion of linear syntax. And it's an old idea, by the way, this goes back as far as Thucydides. The illusion of linear syntax, because a prose sentence is a kind of useful, delicious illusion, probably generated by that same unresolved tension in time that I've been speaking about. I don't know what reality is, but I know for sure that it is far more jagged, uneven, and unfinished than a good prose sentence. Poetry works differently on the mind and on our sense of the real. There are complex modal forms in South Indian languages, especially as-if counterfactual statements that hypertrophy both in everyday speech and in more elegant literary prose, more so than in poetry. And thirdly, I think it's not quite by chance that Imam al-Arus chose to play with the possibilities of prose through this compelling story, The City of Copper, which is in itself, this is my argument, a brilliant meditation on the confusing but ever-present rhythms of time. In fact, I would say that Imam al-Arus thematizes that same tensile, temporal, and causal illusion that lies at the heart of our story. So, before I close, I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the film that many of you saw yesterday. Oliver Lasche's remarkable film, Mimosas. And as I've already hinted, I think this baffling and rather breathtaking film is an unconscious, probably unconscious, modern version of The City of Copper. It has that odd simultaneous temporal flow in at least two contrasting rhythms. Also some awareness of the tantalizing gap or break in time that I've been speaking about. There's the agonizingly slow movement of the caravan through the mountains. It's a kind of eternity. I've now seen this film, I guess, 5 times. I'm not sure I can bear to see it another time because it's only 90 minutes, but it feels like forever, that movement through the mountains. And that kind of eternity also, interestingly, is the time of dreams and visions and riddles and divination, failed divination. I think that's important, and that the film sheds light on the story because of that. And when the journey ends, when eternity is finished, the mad heroes die. And then there is the odd modern rush of cars through the desert. as if without any real goal or purpose, everyday time. The two rhythms converge in the eccentric figure of the mystic Shakib. He's the one with the long, scraggly hair and the burning eyes, whose task it is to make sure that the caravan finds the city of copper, Sijil Masa, as Ibn Khaldun has told us. And right from the start, we can see that Shakib is more than slightly mad. He's drunk on God or on truth. We first meet him telling a story to the drivers waiting to be called to work. A story, he says, about earth, about its creation. So what does he say? God created Adam from dust or from clay. He called the angels to bow down to him. Iblis, that is Iblis, Satan, he started to bow down little by little. Do you remember? He slowly shows you little by little that slow movement. And at the last moment, Iblis raised his head, and he saw God breathing the soul, nafs, into human beings. And since then, Iblis knows the secret of human beings, and he plays with them as he likes. That's what Shakib says. And the caravan is accompanying an old sheikh who wants to die and be buried with his ancestors in Sijil Masa, the city of copper, but he dies too soon, early in the journey, and the caravan falls apart. Only the thief and rogue Ahmad, remember Ahmad? He's the true hero of the film, and his dark friend Saeed, also a thief, are left to carry the corpse across the mountains to Sijil Masa. Shakib joins them, though they see that he is strange. And an old man and his mute daughter, Ikram, also turn up. Early on, Ahmad, despairing, says, if we continue through the mountains, death will be certain. That's what we want. And a second later, he hears the old sheikh say independently these same words, death is what we want. And Ahmad is astonished. He said the same thing I said. Shakib knows things, like Abdel in our story, but he knows them in strangely, even self-parodic ways. He has a charm, a bodily gesture that he says will tell you what to do when you don't know the way, remember? Unfortunately, the charm never works. Neither does the act of divination that Ahmed resorts to. There are two birds on a mountain. And Ahmed says, since they don't know what to do, Ahmed says, if they fly home, we stay here. If they stay, we move on. Then they wait a minute or two. What happens? One bird flies off, One bird flies off. It's as if God is strangely silent throughout, as is his habit, although the journey itself is presented to us as a kind of prayer or invocation. Each section, 3 sections, they're named after the bodily movements, kneeling, prostrating, arising, that each Muslim performs 5 times each day. But what kind of a prayer is it? There seems to be a riddle, unanswerable, somewhere at its heart, like the final riddle that Tadmur Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, once posed to Solomon, or like the secret that Iblis found out when God breathed life into the human being. A dimension of absurdity inheres in the entire progression. Perhaps we're seeing the absurdity of faith itself. That's a nice North African thought. Think of Tertullian in the 2nd century at Carthage. Tertullian famously said, "Creo quia absurdum," I believe because it's absurd. Because it's absurd. And all this makes me wonder if the ironic and parodic impulse is present, although hidden in our coffee house story itself. So I'll let you think about that and decide for yourself. But in any case, the film offers us that final mad rush to die into the fantasy or illusion, in a city with its 7 walls, each made of a different metal, its 8 towers, its 14 mountains, its 6 navigable rivers flowing into the ocean, its 15 gates. And Ahmed, who has slowly matured into a human being in the course of this apparently pointless journey, but who is now almost comatose, destroyed by its terrors, he rides with Shakib into the midst of the murderous mob that is torturing the mute girl, Ikram, to death by hanging. And you remember Shakib says to him, Ahmed, he says, Ahmed, let us go. The time has come. Over and over again he says, the time has come. And Ahmed says, how will we do it? And Shakib says, with love. Over and over again he says, bihub, Hub, we'll do it with love. And he rushes in, Shakib, with his toy sword to save her, and at the very last moment she cries out his name, her first and only word. Terror opens her mouth. And this image, by the way, comes from a short story by the Moroccan author Mohammed Murabit, which I recommend. I owe this discovery to Peg Olin. Thank you, Peg. So let us continue, brother. Eternity is waiting for us. That's Shakib again. But can eternity really wait? This is big time, with death at its core, and apparently that fatal tardiness that marks the start and the end of little time, human time. If eternity is itself the final riddle, then the only answer is the equally opaque counter-riddle of death, that third time or no time that exists when big time and little time, or potential time and actual time, mingle with one another in the city of the living dead, where time itself is trapped, probably forever, in a sealed copper container, just like us. Everything is for eternity, says Oliver Lache, the director. And I like that thought. Everything is for eternity. There's something comforting in the sentence. And Lache also says persuasively, there is nothing unexpected that is not secretly expected. So I'm just going to take a few moments to sum up. I've spoken about the Arabic text of the City of Copper, about its Tamil version, about the film, spoken about Abu Bakr al-Razi and Nasiri Khusro and the Ismaili theologians. And believe me, we've barely begun to enter into that unnerving city. But there is something that weaves together all these diverse tones and themes. Common to all the major voices is an often non-explicit idea of timeless time, or deathless death, of voidless void, and of the great cognitive riddle that stems from this set of apparent paradoxes. It is by no means certain that knowledge, even divinely sanctioned knowledge, can resolve them. We might add to them the doorway without a doorkeeper that we know from the City of Copper. That doorway, already filled with death, leads in both directions, inward to azal or dahar or mudda, that is absolute time, outward to zaman, dafa, waqt muayyan, everyday time. I think it's helpful to think of that doorway as holding in itself the creative instant, where we also inevitably find the time lag, the hesitation, the fatal delay, which are denied, and the necessary but often obscure traces and signs, which are affirmed. It is that deeply ingrained paradox that has given us the City of Copper. Time, says Nasiri Khusro, can only be understood by humans as imagined, and that is because, he says, the human soul is tied to a body that is under the sway of time. Time is the life of a thing, this is Nasiri Khusro, time is the life of a thing whose life comes to it from another, unlike the aliveness of something or someone living through its own nature. And interestingly, the human being shares both of these definitions. He says they hold true that man's essence is eternal, that his continuance is without end, but his existence is not without a beginning. Note that eloquent double negative. Intelligence, aql, by definition eternal, is equivalent to dahar, the big, beginningless time. Human beings have aql, and they also have nafs, the living spirit breath, which, though intimately associated with little time, the time of experience, is also without end. As others have said before me, the City of Copper is a journey into time, into the depths of time, where the creative instant, that almost non-existent, imperceptible gap, can be experienced if one follows the traces and markers left along the way. I don't think the journey has a goal. This journey is, as we know, saturated with death and the still living traces of the dead. It also enacts the movement from the potential to the actual, that most human of temporal modes. And that movement is equivalent to the turning that the nafs takes toward form and substance, including, I suppose, a good story. But all the signs and traces we encounter in our story, frozen in a dead language, exhort the reader to the opposite turning, from mortal form and substance back to the true source, the principle of a timeless aliveness. Probably that slight instant of turning always faces both ways and, like thought itself, tends toward the tardy, the secondary reflection, the less than lucid insight. Whether we think in terms of a temporal duality like Razi, or remain with the synthetic vision of Nasiri Khusro and his followers, it appears that time itself always precedes the birth of time, which is a devolved, even debased version of itself. Within time there must be a tension, an expectancy, as if time awaits the interruption of its natural rhythm and its impregnation by the nafs, a passing moment chosen by God so that our kind of time can begin just a little late. In the story, death is ultimate transience, the very essence of evanescent everyday time, which comes to an end for each individual, as the text keeps telling us. Transience is true. Time slips away from us, and death is real. But death apparently can also subsist within life, and vice versa. We are surrounded by the living dead, also by the still living traces of their lives, which are capable of speaking to us with a burning, though anachronistic, urgency. The inscriptions are the signals deposited in time, the trace left by action. Or, perhaps, as I've suggested, they might be the dissonant voices of time itself, no less trapped in this world than we are. The depths of time reveal, as one approaches them, the coincidence of the two or perhaps three primary rhythms we have explored. Both are at work in the present instant. It is both fleeting. We can always hear that tough, tough, tough. And oddly eternal, holding all of time and world inside it. That coincidence hardly makes sense unless we think of it as the unending movement of potentiality into actuality, because the actual will always lag behind the potential and is doomed to being late, indeed too late. Such a movement will never be fully in sync with God's own time, and it will always leave behind a slight gap, a trace, like the city of the living dead, like the book that speaks for its vanishing author. Can we ever see past that gap or that haunting trace? Do they really exist? Do they both exist and not exist? Is death also a gap, at once riddled with timefulness and utterly empty of time? These are the questions that lead one to the city of copper, or perhaps, like Amir Musa at the end of his life, to Jerusalem, where, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, there still may be a chance to discover, to know, even to understand deathless death, space without space, and timeless time. Thank you very much. Right. Yeah. David.
Hi. Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. I was thinking about the movie, and I have a theory. The theory is that this sheikh, the one who is going to help this other, the caravan, he might be, I thought to myself, maybe an angel. The boss, he seems to know everything about the situation.
Yeah.
Oh, this caravan, you have to protect them because their leader is going to die. Yeah. And then he has this naivety that we sometimes associate with angels. Angels are so important for Muslims, for Christians. I think there's this I don't know, I felt maybe, I was thinking about this other movie of Wim Wenders, Der Himmel über Berlin, the one that was translated as Winds of Desire, I think, in the US. These angels are there kind of listening to us crying or having problems, but they cannot do much. They feel so frustrated. Yeah. And I felt that with the figure of this mystic who is there trying to help them, but cannot do much. I don't know what you think about these thoughts. Also, the idea of the taxi drivers, no? They were almost like these angels trying to get their souls to the heavenly. But I don't know, maybe I'm just dreaming aloud.
Thank you, David. I think that Shakib, this is Shakib, he's got the innocence of an angel, that's true. Of course, he's very weird. And there's something ridiculous about him over and over again. I mean, he talks about faith, and he's praying all the time. He says everything he does, everything he says, but actually none of it ever seems to work. And it's possible to read the end of the film where he comes dashing into this, maybe this is all happening somewhere in the recesses of his mind, I mean, it kind of looks like that. I think of him, though, in relation to the story. This is obviously, it's not a kind of complete, it's not a carbon copy of the City of Copper. It's something that has somehow absorbed those materials and done something new with them. I think of him as being like Abdel, this wise old man who is the one who's able to decipher all of the descriptions and somehow gets them to the end. And we don't know what happens to him at the end, right? Just as we don't know with Shakib. But, thank you.
Take the opportunity to ask a question. I'm struck. Time and the discrepancy between the two modes of time that you've been talking about is a product in some of these views of the human imagination, and yet it seems to me, or involves the human imagination in some way, and yet it seems to me that it also poses the limitations of that imagination, the failure of that imagination almost. And what I was thinking about at moments in your talk was the commensurability between the views that you're talking about here and two other instances. One is slightly mundane. I'm thinking about Fernand Braudel's historiography and the conjunctures between the longue durée and the froth on the wave of history that is the momentary time that you're talking about. But more importantly, more recently, I'm thinking about Anthropocene writing, especially Dipesh Chakrabarty, but other writers as well, who are trying to wrestle with the fact that we cannot come to grips with the Anthropocene because the scales of time that are involved are so immense in comparison to the momentary time that we can imagine, that there simply is a gap in our imaginary powers to get there. And this all is, you're reminding me of all of this.
Yeah, I think actually the minute we start thinking about time in any serious way, these incongruities are going to come up to the fore because obviously, none of us experience time as an even flow. Human beings do not. They may think there is such a thing. There are scientists who think like that, I guess. Although I've been recently reading a book of these physicists about the physics of time. They tend to think that time is an illusion altogether. But I think that the notion of a kind of dissonance between one's own, lived time and some other dimension of time is a kind of universal phenomenon. But I do think it's inflected differently in different cultures, obviously, different texts and so on. So here I think there's a fairly specific, in the story, I think it comes out of an attempt to, as it were, enact these incongruities or these different rhythms. And that's the beauty of the story in a way, because these two rhythms, although they're incompatible, they're also embedded in one another. So that you're not ever able actually to say, you see, if it were an allegory, yesterday we were talking about an allegory would say, okay, we're going to die, but there's an eternal life, and we'll go into that eternal life. Then it'll be fine. Kind of positive and optimistic view of life. But it's nothing like that. The story doesn't leave you with that. It gives you just the opposite, with the sense that mortal human beings living in time experience some sense of kind of eternal dimension, and that eternity is somehow, I don't know, at odds with their experience of themselves as mortal and fragile beings. And there's no real resolution to that, I guess. That's, to my mind, one of the great things in the story. It doesn't leave you with a kind of simple formula, but it does, I think, articulate the problem in an amazing way. Yeah.
Dave, I'll talk about it because I don't think I can get up to the microphone right now. But I've been thinking as I listen to this a lot today, but I've been trying to put it back into an Indian context.
Yeah.
Because in some ways the story is very un-Indian, although it clearly has, as I told you as we talked. There are Indian stories about going to a city of iron or a city of brass and so on.
Right.
But they end up as karma stories.
Mm-hmm.
There's also this notion in Indian philosophy that there is time at large and then there's ordinary daytime.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got the same dichotomy that you speak of.
Yeah.
But when I think about stories that are about the complexity of time, I think about something like the Yoga Vasishta,
Right.
which really isn't talking about eternity at all. I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I think it's talking about the impossibility of time. And I wonder what you think
The
about
impossibility or the possibility?
the
Impossibility of time. Yeah.
I mean, these people experience time and then they experience one set of events in time and then wake up and it's not that.
Right.
So I wonder what you think about it in an Indian context.
So, in a way, the city of copper looks like a kind of Yoga Vasishta story, I suppose. The elements of that kind of absurd, paradoxical experience are very present there. I don't know. The Yoga Vasishta, of course, not just a single thing, but again and again, you're right. There's this notion that we don't perceive the world, we can't see the world as it is. There's a huge illusion which envelops us at all times. But the amazing thing, as Gary Taubes said, the amazing thing in the Yoga Vasishta is that it doesn't recommend that we wake up from this illusion into some kind of sane, sober perception, but rather wants us to wake up into the illusion, thereby reinforcing it. So I don't know that there's anything like that in these materials that I've been talking about. But it's a good example, of course, the Yoga Vasishta, of the same kind of problematic that, once you begin thinking about what lived experience is in relation to other kinds of time. Yeah. Thank you.
I guess my question is, in the story, in the City of Copper, there's like all these references to God being beyond time. My question is God in this thinking the kind of eternal mode of time, or is God timeless time? And is there some kind of differentiation between these two concepts?
So that's one of these questions that were bones of contention between Razi and the Ismailis, because Razi, this was one of the points that caused him to be considered heretical and to be excommunicated by a later generation. Nasiri Khusro, who I keep quoting, thought of Razi as a heretic. Why was that? That was because, among other things, because Razi thought that time precedes God and exists independently of God. It has its own nature. That nature is a double nature, that kind of, absolute time and conditioned time and so on. But nonetheless, it exists in the world along with various other things, like God, like space, like matter, like the soul. Those are the elements that are all there from the beginning, and they're independent of God's intentionality or will. The Ismailis don't like that idea. You can see why they would not. So they want to have an orderly sequence in which there is God, who has a kind of timelessness in time, right? He embodies this timelessness. And then there's a transition in which God is somehow complicit or involved from that eternal mode into the mode of human time or everyday time or something like that. Now, if your question is, what about the story? Where does it position itself? I think it positions itself very much in the seam line between these two positions, giving a kind of articulation to both of them. And the city of copper is kind of a place like that, if you think about it. See, I mean, on the one hand, these people are there, they're looking straight at eternity. That's this, right? This is a kind of seemingly motionless time. But on the other hand, that's the time of transience and death. Everything is passed away. The inscriptions keep telling us over and over again. You know. So what kind of eternity is it? It's as if eternity itself was evanescent. No? Something like that. So that's, I think, a rather amazing thought, and it's a thought that sort of naturally emerges out of this kind of story, you know. And that's why it resists the allegorical impulse, you know. It resists it because the complexity of its understanding of time has to allow for this kind of paradoxical oscillation between two different poles, you know. Yeah.
I forgot in Arabic, but in many folk tales there's a formula, right? It's like can something, can makan. But in terms of the language of if you were to go to a kind of Propian analysis, like does the language itself create this, you know, this mythic time? Certain formulas that are specific to each language or the literary tradition of each language.
So, yeah. That's the question?
That's the question, yeah. I forgot in Arabic, it's something like kan makan. There's something missing in between.
You know, kan is that's the verb of being. So, right, that's what Allah says when He brings the world into existence. He says, kun, be. Yeah. So, yeah, it could be. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the notion that the Arabic version of the story has within it already embedded in the language certain temporal notions that are not explicit, you know. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking David Shulman.
Thanks,